All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is doing great and wonderful today. Today is Teachable Tuesday. Happy spring. Spring has finally sprung, thank God. And if you're like me, you have been looking forward to it. So, today is Teachable Tuesday, and we're going to be talking Black history. We're also going to be back in our book on immigration. And this past week, a gentleman by the name of James Cone passed away. And he was known as the father of the Black Liberation Systematic Theology, Black Liberation Movement. And I want to read a little bit from his last book, which was part research and part memoir, called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. If you've been on my social media pages, you know that I have been sharing a little bit and kind of posting some things out of his last book. The Cross and the Lynching Tree. A couple years ago, I started doing some research and study around this subject matter because I knew that God was dealing with us about lynchings and memorials and good morning, everyone, and what spiritual connection that had for America. And then I started doing more research and found out that America had never passed a federal law that dealt with the crime of lynching. And so that was when, God was really ministering to us about this sin, this undealt with sin and blood on the hands of America. He was dealing with us about the fact that many times we look at abortion as the only kind of sin that has the blood of the innocents involved with it, but this sin of lynching also has the blood of the innocents unaccounted for and unpaid for. And so we began as a ministry to embark on dealing with this particular sin over our nation, the consequences of it. Good morning. And as we can see, we're still paying the consequences for it, and lynchings are actually still taking place. You don't hear them all in the news, but we know even in Virginia where we were, one took place a couple years back. So the man was actually found on a playground. Okay, so this is something that is still going on in our nation that has not been accounted for. So Dr. James Cone, father of the liberation theology, and it's going to tell us a little bit today as we do the introduction to the book. I'm still in the midst of it myself, but I will read you the introduction if you're interested in getting the book. Also, we're going back into Heart and Soul, the story of America and African Americans. All right. We're going to continue our reading there. I think we are now at Harlem and the Vote for Women. We're going to learn about what happened in Harlem. And then we're going to close out with talking about, or beginning to talk about, Cuban immigration to the United States, the history of Cuban immigration to the United States. All right, so those are the topics and the content that we are going to cover today. Remember, we are trying to get to the 1,000,000 heart mark, so if you would, please press the hearts. That also lets me know that nothing is going on with the broadcast and that you all can still hear and see. All right. We know yesterday it cut off around the 30-minute mark, and so I had to come back. So if that does happen on Periscope, I will, excuse me, I will restart the broadcast and come back in. All right. Any other things I want you to know? Yes. I am going to be closing soon the sign up for those of you who are interested in the technology workshop. Remember, we are covering Facebook, we're covering YouTube Live, and we're also covering how to start your own blog. So I have about 6 more spaces for that, and then I'm going to close it. The registration for it is only $10. You can email me at reachshante@gmail.com to let me know whether or not you're participating, because once I get to the cutoff, it's going to be closed. All right. And it will be a private live stream only for those who are participating. All right. Last thing, I'm going to get an opportunity to go to something really, really cool tonight. So if I'm allowed to live stream, I will live stream it and let you all know where I am. So that will be a mystery until I get there this evening about 7 o'clock. All right. So hopefully I will be able to live stream from it to let you guys in on what's going on here in the Baltimore area. So let's get to it. The cross and the lynching tree. One thing, if you are an avid reader, sometimes it's good to date and sign your books and look at when you bought certain material so you can go back and why you bought your material. So this book I actually marked the date of when I got the book. And that's just something that I do as a note to myself, to let me know when I added certain things to my collection and what did I add them for. James Cone writes, this book is dedicated to the memory of Black people whose lives were lost on the lynching tree. Introduction. What was it that made me conscious of possibilities? From where in the southern darkness had I caught a sense of freedom? Why was it that I was able to act upon vaguely felt emotions? I had been through books that I had managed to keep myself alive, and that had evoked in me vague glimpses of life's possibilities. Richard Wright. Theme for Negro writers will emerge when they have begun to feel the meaning of the history of the race as though they in one lifetime had lived it themselves throughout all of the long centuries. Also written by Richard Wright. The cross and the lynching tree are separated by nearly 2,000 years. One is the universal symbol of Christian faith. The other is the quintessential symbol of Black oppression in America. Though both are symbols of death, one represents a message of hope and salvation, while the other signifies the negation of that message by white supremacy. Despite the obvious similarities between Jesus' death on the cross and the death of thousands of Black men and women strung up to die on a lamppost or tree, relatively few people, apart from Black poets, novelists, and other reality-seeing artists, have explored the symbolic connections. Yet, I believe this is a challenge we must face. What is at stake is the credibility and promise of the Christian gospel and the hope that we may heal the wounds of racial violence that continue to divide our churches and our society. In its heyday, the lynching of Black Americans was no secret. It was a public spectacle, often announced in advance in newspapers and over radios, attracting crowds of up to 20,000 people. An unspeakable crime, it is a memory that most white Americans would prefer. For African Americans, the memory of disfigured Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze is so painful that they too try to keep these horrors buried deep down in their consciousness until, like a dormant volcano, they erupt uncontrollably, causing profound agony and pain. But as with the evils of chattel slavery and Jim Crow segregation, Blacks and whites and other Americans who want to understand the true meaning of the American experience need to remember lynching. To forget this atrocity leaves us with a fraudulent perspective of this society and of the meaning of the Christian gospel for this nation. While the lynching tree is seldom discussed or depicted, the cross is one of the most visible symbols of Americans' Christians' origins. Many Christians embrace the conviction that Jesus died on the cross to redeem humankind from sin. Taking our place, Jesus suffered on the cross and gave his life as a ransom for many. Mark 10:45. We are now justified by God's grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forth as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. Romans 3, verse 24 through 25. The cross is the great symbol of the Christian narrative of salvation. Unfortunately, during the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, this symbol of salvation has been detached from any reference to the ongoing suffering and oppression of human beings, those whom Ignacio Ellacuría, the Salvadoran martyr, called the crucified peoples of history. The cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks. Rather than reminding us of the cost of discipleship, it has become a form of cheap grace, an easy way to salvation that doesn't force us to confront the power of Christ's message and mission. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. I was born in Arkansas, he writes, a lynching state. During my childhood, white supremacy ruled supreme. White people were virtually free to do anything to blacks with impunity. The violent crosses of the Ku Klux Klan were a familiar reality, and white racists preached a dehumanizing, segregated gospel in the name of Jesus' cross every Sunday. And yet in rural black churches, I heard a different message, as preachers proclaimed the message of the suffering Jesus and the salvation accomplished in his death on the cross. I noticed how the passion and energy of the preacher increased whenever he talked about the cross, and the congregation responded with outbursts of amen and hallelujah that equaled the intensity of the sermon oration. People shouted, clapped their hands, and stomped their feet, as if a powerful living reality of God's Spirit had transformed them from nobodies in white society to somebodies in the black church. This black religious experience, with all its tragedy and hope, was the reality in which I was born and raised. Its paradoxes and incongruities have shaped everything I have said and done. If I have anything to say to the Christian community in America and around the world, it is rooted in the tragic and hopeful reality that sustains and empowers black people to resist the forces that seem designed to destroy every ounce of dignity in their souls and bodies. This work is a continuation of my previous works, each of them in different ways motivated by a central question: how to reconcile the gospel message of liberation with the reality of black oppression. But in many ways, this book is also personal. Its subject brings me back to my first memories of hearing the gospel, as well as back to primal memories of terror and violence that were a part of the reality of growing up in the Jim Crow South. As a child, I watched my mother and father deal with segregation and the threats of lynching, and was deeply affected by their examples and by the sacrifices they made to keep their children safe. Through the black religious experience, I caught a vision of my possibility, entering Christian ministry in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, made my way to college and seminary at Northwestern University in 1965. My journey was long and hard, but I was determined to be more than what America had intended for me. As the book kept Richard Wright alive and gave him vague glimpses of life's possibilities, the black church and theological texts kept me wrestling with life and faith, trying to find meaning in a society and an intellectual discourse that did not even acknowledge I existed. Question: how could I find meaning in a world that ignored black people? Food for thought. I decided that I had to say something about this contradiction. My first theological cry burst forth with the publication of Black Theology and Black Power in 1969. I found my voice in the social, political, religious, and cultural context of the civil rights and Black Power movements of the 60s. The Newark and Detroit riots in July 1967 and the assassination of Martin Luther King shortly thereafter in April 1968 were the events that shook me out of my theological complacency, forcing me to realize the bankruptcy of any theology in America that did not engage the religious meaning of the African American struggle for justice. What I studied in graduate school ignored white supremacy and black resistance against it, as if they had nothing to do with the Christian gospel and the discipline of theology. Silence on both white supremacy and the black struggle against racial segregation made me angry with a fiery rage that had to find expression. How could any theologian explain the meaning of Christian identity in America and fail to engage white supremacy in its primary negation? I concluded that it was my responsibility to address the great contradictory notion of white supremacy posing for Christianity in America. Published 3 months before I arrived at Union Theological Seminary in New York, Black Theology and Black Power was followed by my book, A Black Theology of Liberation, The Spirituals and the Blues, and God of the Oppressed, which I wrote in 1975. In my next work, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare, published in 1991, I returned explicitly to the two figures whose influence had combined to shape the theme and style of Black liberation theology. Most people rejected one and embraced the other, seeing Martin and Malcolm as rivals or nemesis, representing oppositional categories of Christian and Black, integration and separation, nonviolence and violence, love and hate. I embraced both of them because I saw them advocating different methods that corrected and complemented each other as they worked for the same goal, the liberation of Black people from white supremacy. Just as I could not separate Martin from Malcolm, neither could I separate my Christian identity from my Blackness. I was Black before I was Christian. My initial challenge was to develop a theology that could be both Black and Christian at the same time and in one voice. That was not easy because even in the Black community, the public meaning of Christianity was white. Hello, Kenny Loggins. Martin King and Malcolm X gave me intellectual resources and the spiritual courage to attack white supremacy. In earlier reflections on the Christian faith and white supremacy, I had focused on the social evils of slavery and segregation. How, and still how could whites confess and live the Christian faith and also impose 3.5 centuries of slavery and segregation, Jim Crow upon Black people? How sway? Self-interest and power corrupted their understanding of the Christian gospel. How could powerless Black people at the time endure and resist the brutality of white supremacy in nearly every aspect of their lives and still keep their sanity? How? The Holy Spirit. I concluded that an imminent presence of a transcendent revelation confirming for Blacks that they were more than what whites said about them gave them an inner spiritual strength to cope with anything that came their way. My interjection here, because after all, you have to have a certain level of spiritual fortitude to endure the atrocities that were brought upon Black people. Therefore, to call them soulless beasts is contradictory what they actually revealed. I wrote, he says, because words were my weapon to resist, to affirm Black humanity, and to defend it. And yet through all this time, I avoided dealing directly with the reality of lynching. As a Southern Black, the subject brought back such painful feelings, but finally I have had no choice. The subject chose me. The symbol of white supremacy was like a wild beast that had seized me by the neck, trying to kill me, and I had to fight it before I could fully live. Reading and writing about the lynching nightmare, looking at many images of tortured Black bodies, has been my deepest challenge and most painful experience I have had as a theologian. At times, it was almost too heavy for me to bear. The more I read about and looked at what whites did to powerless blacks, the angrier I became. Paradoxically, anger soon gave way to a profound feeling of liberation. Being able to write about lynching liberated me from being confined by it. The cross helped me to deal with the brutal legacy of the lynching tree, and the lynching tree helped me to understand the tragic meaning of the cross. In writing this book, my primary concern is to give voice to black victims, to let them and their families and communities speak to us, exploring the question, how did ordinary blacks, like my mother and father, survive the lynching atrocity and still keep together their families, their communities, and not lose their sanity? How could they live meaningful lives knowing that they could be lynched for any small violation of what Richard Wright called the ethics of living Jim Crow? I wrestle with questions about black dignity in a world of white supremacy because I believe that the cultural and religious resources in the black experience could actually help all Americans cope with the legacy of white supremacy and also deal more effectively with what is called the war on terror. If white Americans could look at the terror they inflicted on their own black population, hello, reaping what you sow, slavery, segregation, and lynching, then they might be able to understand what is coming at them from other people, other countries, other places. Black people would know something about terror because we have been dealing with legal and extra legal white terror for several centuries. Nothing was more terrifying during the 1930s and 50s than the lynching tree. I do not write this book as the last word about the cross and the lynching tree. I write it in order to start a conversation so that we can explore the many ways to heal the deep wounds lynching has inflicted upon us. The cross can heal and hurt. It can be empowering and liberating, but also enslaving and oppressive. There is no way in which the cross can be interpreted. There is no one way, in which the cross can be interpreted. I offer my reflections because I believe that the cross placed alongside the lynching tree can help us to see Jesus in America in a new light and thereby empower people who claim to follow him to take a stand against white supremacy and every kind of injustice. So that is the introduction to The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, if you're interested in this book. All right. He gives you a lot of thought-provoking things to think about. And as I said, as I continue to begin to study what happened with lynching, you can see the parallels between what has gone on in this country and the suffering that Christ partook in on the cross and the kind of death that Christ suffered. If you really begin to study it, you start to see parallels of the kinds of death that Black Americans in this country suffered. All right. So I know this is not a subject matter that everybody's just gung-ho about getting into, but America needs to deal with all of its past, the good stuff and the bad stuff. All right. And until we reconcile what we have done to our fellow human, we're going to continue to see some of the things that we see because we have not reconciled what we've done. The Lynching Museum in Alabama is an excellent example of someone taking the initiative to help this nation reconcile with what has happened in the past. Very interesting that on the day of the country's first ever memorial to lynching, James Cone went home to be with the Lord. All right. I think his part of the journey, his part of the conversation that he started, he did his work. He finished the faith. He kept his course. And I believe that there are plenty of us that can pick up where he left off and continue that conversation. So, Heart and Soul, we're reading about Harlem and the vote for women. And This ties right into what James Cone was talking about in terms of the terrorism that Black people endured in this country. All right. And that we have, as a people, developed some fortitude around terror because for centuries our ancestors have been dealing with it in some way, shape, or form. This is a image that Kadir Nelson painted called Black Neighborhoods Being Burned and Looted All Over the Country. Harlem and the Vote for Women. We return from fighting, we return fighting. W.E.B. Du Bois, scholar and PhD. The right to vote is ours. Have it we must. Use it we will. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, woman's suffragist. The summer before the war officially ended was dreadful. It was hot, people were hungry, streets were crowded because there wasn't enough work or housing. The soldiers were coming home from war, and Southerners kept coming north, adding to the crowds. So this is still during the time of the Great Migration. All right. The combination seemed to make some white folks lose their minds. Mobs of angry white people began to storm into Black neighborhoods, grabbing people off the street and beating them to death. All summer long, they were burning Black folks' homes and businesses in big cities all over the country to try to scare us away. So when someone says, why is there such an economic gap? Why is there a wealth gap? Where is Black community? What happened to Black community? We need to stop having one-sided conversations and ignoring the fact that the other side of that conversation is who destroyed Black businesses and Black communities and who was burning down stuff and tearing down stuff. All right. So if you're going to talk Black poverty, I need you to add white terrorism into that with that conversation. Black poverty, white terrorism. Okay. All right. Historians, Black poverty, white terrorism. Economists, Black poverty, white terrorism. Political pundits, Black poverty, white terrorism. And I have to say this because I keep seeing conversations where people want to talk about what Black people aren't doing while negating the fact of what Black people were doing and how white people lost their minds and could not take the economic advancement. And so they began to tear down what Black people had built up. So when you see a pathology now of Black people tearing it down themselves, let's go back to who was tearing it down first that drove people into a hopeless state. And now they are, as I call it, it is white supremacy on autopilot. So now I don't have to come into your neighborhoods anymore to tear it down. You're now programmed to self-destruct. All right. Any of you all have seen the video? Several people sent it to me. I don't really listen to rap, but so much conversation was going on about this video that I actually took a look at it. Childish Gambino, also known as Donald Glover, put out a video called This Is America. If you have not seen the video, you can watch the video with music or without music, and you'll see the. And a lot of people said they had a hard time at first focusing on what was happening in the background while he was dancing in the foreground of the video. It was just the opposite for me. When I looked at it, it was like I tuned out him and the minstrel show he was doing, and I just focused on all of the events that were happening in the background. And it was a good picture of what has now happened in many of our urban areas where Black people are populous. People are focused on the dancing. They're focused on the entertainment, which is a smoke screen for the destruction happening in the background. So again, if we're going to have a conversation about what happened to Black community, what happened to Black business, what happened to Black society, we have to add in the conversation of white terrorism. And that white terrorism was driven by fear. Okay? It was driven by fear of not having enough and fear of scarcity. Same fear being pumped out today in our society. People are here to take your jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When if you look at the market, it's not people taking your jobs, it's technology and it's automation that is taking the jobs of everybody. All right? But if I can find a person to blame or I can scapegoat a group of people, then it takes the focus away from the fact of what's really taking your jobs, so you're not paying attention to that. This generation of Black people was different from past generations. Many of our parents and grandparents had often looked for help from good white folks in hard times like these. But this generation had grown up and into its own. Many of them had begun to graduate from public schools or Black universities like Howard and Tuskegee, and education had given them the tools they needed to move forward. We all felt like we were on a mission to uplift the race and do away with that feeling of being less than whites. This time we looked no farther than our front doorstep for help. It was like the souls of Black folks all over the North were waking up. Now, Chicago was something special. We had the Strip on the South Side where we could go watch a movie, see a show, have soul food. Our Negro League baseball team, the Chicago American Giants, was the best in town. But at that particular time, most of the action was happening in Harlem in New York City. Folks would come to visit from there looking sharp as a tack. They brought with them fancy clothes, the best jazz records, and jazz was a new kind of music where horn players, drummers, and piano players made beautiful music right on the spot. This music would swing and sway, making us dizzy with the sounds of Jelly Roll Morton, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington. They put us all in a tizzy. Jazz music took over the country. More jazz records sold than any other kind of music, and all the young folks couldn't get enough of it. Everybody seemed to want to learn to play an instrument and be in a jazz band. Now fast forward to 2018, look up jazz and see who represents jazz right now. On the weekend, we would paint the town red honey, dancing all night in the Savoy in Chicago, wearing holes into the floor. Folks talked about Josephine Baker, who danced in the Cotton Club and became a big star in Europe, and artists Aaron Douglas and Archibald Motley, who painted big pictures of Black folks strong and proud, just the way we like to see ourselves. We read Black writers from Harlem like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and James Weldon Johnson, who told our stories with beauty and style. For the first time ever, Black folks were in the limelight, and the whole world was watching. These new Negroes, as author Alan Locke called us, had arrived, and we were beautiful. Black folks were as busy as a swarm of honeybees uptown in Harlem, and downtown was abuzz too. Women had decided to step out of the kitchen to get the vote and were marching up and down the streets of New York and Washington, D.C., trying to get it. Since America was founded, women never had any say about what happened outside the home. You see images. This is an image painted by Kadir Nelson of a Harlem couple. As you can see, very well put together, very dapper, and nothing demeaning about them. Here is another one, another painting of his example of a big band. And women beginning to march black women's suffrage because they too wanted the right to vote. All right. So, up until this point, women were not in control of much that happened outside the home. We were expected to marry, have children, keep house, and obey our husbands. In fact, at that time, women really weren't much more than property, barely a step above being a slave. We were not allowed to own property if we were married. We were not allowed to attend college, not allowed any respectable career outside of teaching or nursing. And of course, we were not allowed to vote. It wasn't fair. Half of the people in America were women. And yet we weren't allowed to have a say about how the country was being run. It was very much a man's world, and we were tired of it. Women had been fighting to get the vote since before the Civil War. Over tea and biscuits and at church rallies, old ladies and young women, black and white, wrote passionate letters to politicians and published articles in newspapers, pleading their case for the vote. They even wrote a Declaration of Rights and sentiments that read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." In the spring of 1912, women took to Washington, D.C. and the New York City streets in march for our right to vote. Black women like Ida B. Wells marched with them the following year, even though white women didn't want us there and made us march in the back. So again, while we're having all of these women's empowerment movements, all right, I need white women to also own their part in white supremacy. Yes, I do. And the men, they tried their best to stop the march. Crowds of them gathered along the sidewalk yelling things like, "Go back to the kitchen," and throwing trash at the women. It was really something to see all of those boys treat us that way, especially since it was we, black women, who had raised so many of them. We had raised many of their parents and grandparents too, along with our own children. It broke our hearts, but we just continued to walk right past them. We were not going back to the kitchen. Instead, on the second day of November 1920, we marched our legs right into the voting booth because we finally won the right to vote. Well, it was really only Northern women who got to vote. The law allowed Southern women to vote, but the truth was that the Southern men made it very hard for women to exercise their right at the polls. And if you look at this past election, you still had Southern men telling their women who they better vote for. I know because I had conversations with several of them. Our progress was right in step with what was happening up north. People were happy because they were working and making a little money, and there were plenty of new things to buy, like automobiles and telephones. It seemed like the good times would go on forever, but there was a big storm coming, and soon people everywhere would be in serious trouble. So what happens? Women get the right to vote, and then hard times and World War II is on its way. So next week, we will look at World War II, and we'll look at the Great Depression. Interesting how we can still see parallels of what is happening and what is on the horizon with our current government. Lastly, immigration. We're reading from the book, This Land is Our Land. I'm going to introduce the history of Cuban immigration. I'm going to make sure that I find a good place for us to stop today. All right. Seeking safety and liberty. I decided to come here because there is freedom of thought and expression. Is there still freedom of thought and expression? Or are we moving to a controlled thought and a controlled expression society? The Cuban named Alejandro, who escaped to the United States, said this when he was 23. Cuba is an island 93 miles off the coast of Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over the government and Cuba became a communist nation. The United States denounced the communists and broke off political relations. Many Cubans who were anti-communist fled the island and were welcomed in the United States. Few were allowed to leave Cuba legally, so on September 21st, 1979, Alejandro and 4 other young men lowered a boat into the water at 2 a.m. Our clothes were dark so that they would not attract attention. When we started, we did not even know how to row. One oar went one way, the other went another. Finally, we caught on to the rhythm of rowing, and we rowed all day. We rowed all day Tuesday and then all the next day and night, coming closer to Florida. But the group ran into a storm and found themselves back near Cuba without food and little water. They reversed, and on the 5th day, they were picked up by an American. He gave us some food, and divers in another boat gave us some sandwiches, apples, and Coca-Cola. In Miami, they were issued temporary papers. It was the start of their lives as refugees in the United States. Refugees are a special kind of immigrant. They can no longer live safely in their home countries because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. That was the definition used in a 1980 law that allowed refugees to immigrate to the United States. People can also face danger in their home countries if they are women or homosexual. Persecution can mean that people who criticize their government or another ethnic group or religion, or who just belong to another ethnic group or religion, can lose their jobs and homes and or be imprisoned, tortured, or even killed. So then that begs the question, has Black America moved to refugee status in the United States? Something to consider. I'm going to read you the definition again. Refugees can no longer live safely in their home countries because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Some of the early colonists who settled in the land that became the United States came because they were not allowed to practice their religions freely. These included the Puritans in New England, the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Others came because they opposed and sometimes rebelled against their governments, but the United States did not have separate laws for refugees who wanted to immigrate until the 1940s. Before that, they might have come in under the regular quota laws, but they could not come automatically or immediately because they were in danger. Even specific laws for refugees did not make it easy for many of them to enter the United States. During and after World War II, there were millions of refugees who had been forced to flee their homes in Europe and Asia. Jewish people were a particular target for the Nazi government in Germany and Austria and other European countries. They were sent to concentration camps, prison camps, with especially harsh and even cruel conditions, and most did not survive. They were the victims of genocide, an attempt to kill an entire ethnic group, which can mean millions of deaths. In the late 1930s, the United States government could see the danger Jews were in. Now, I find it impossible for our government to see the danger that Jews were in the 1930s and not see the danger that Black people in. Houseway. So we can look all the way over at another country and see, these people are being persecuted because of their racial identity. Let us do something about it. But we can't look at our own government and see the disparity, the extrajudicial murders, the lynchings that are still taking place, the accosting of Black people, and beating them, the accosting of black people by citizens who just start attacking them, using racial slurs and attacking them openly, and this is increasing daily, but we don't see the danger. Houseway. I'm not understanding. President Franklin Roosevelt and some members of Congress expressed concern, but little was done to change the immigration laws or bring refugees to the country in large numbers. Myron C. Taylor, who led the U.S. delegation to an international conference on political refugees in 1938, assured Americans that our plans do not involve flooding of this or any other country with aliens of any race or creed. In 1939, the German ship St. Louis, which was carrying 933 refugees, was not allowed to land in the United States. Most of the passengers were already on the quota list but had not been fully processed. The ship was forced to return to Europe. America. The ship was forced to return to Europe, and many of the passengers died during World War II. Elise Riddell, an 8-year-old German girl who was Jewish, was accepted by the United States. She remembered what happened to her home on November 9, 1938. The SS, a German paramilitary group, pushed us aside and came into the house. They went about this utter destruction with axes. The closet was knocked over, all the pictures on the wall, and the furniture. The pillows were ripped, feathers, everything was thrown all over the house. This anti-Jewish violence destroyed thousands of businesses, temples, and homes. The night of November 9th through 10th came to be called Kristallnacht or Crystal Night or the Night of Broken Glass because of all the glass fragments from broken windows littering the streets throughout Germany. Riddell's father was one of some 30,000 Jewish men sent to concentration camps at the time, but he was released. The family was determined to flee. You couldn't get a visa to America unless you had relatives there, said Riddell. I think Roosevelt could have tried to open the quota a little bit. But we had an aunt who had come to the U.S. in 1936. We finally managed to get the visas, and we got on a boat and landed here in August 1939. My father got a job in a fabric store as a stock boy. He owned a large textile firm where he was, but now he only earned $11 a week. The United States did take in some refugees before the end of 1941 when it entered the war, and did relax some requirements. The country was not alone in turning down Jewish refugees. France, which accepted them freely until 1933, began tightening its policies. England did not take many Jewish refugees. Some fled to Palestine, an area of the Middle East that the League of Nations gave to England to control after World War I, that later became the country of Israel. England closed it to refugees in 1939. Turkey accepted Jewish refugee scientists, and Philippines and Shanghai, China, were other Jewish refugee destinations. It is true that in the 1930s, the United States and its allies could not have foreseen the horror of mass executions that were to come. But anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish sentiment in many countries and in the United States, sticking to the principles of the quota law, meant that 6 million European Jews and 6 million other people found no refuge and died at the hands of the Nazis. After World War II, there were millions of displaced persons who were not living in their home countries. Some were able to return, but many sought refuge in immigration. The United States had fought the war to gain freedom for all people in Europe and Asia. Many Europeans wanted to come to the United States, but almost no Asian refugees came during the year. So what do we see happening? I get very concerned when I see our government repeating history. I get very concerned when we know that genocide is happening in other places, and we're now doing the same thing that we did in the 1930s, which is close off our borders from people coming who are under genocide. All right? That's one thing I'm concerned about. The other thing I'm concerned about is closing off your borders so no one can get in to stop a potential genocide from happening to your own citizens. So, I think we actually need to look at both of those. And I think those of you who know how to pray need to be praying. That's all I say about that. If you didn't understand what I just said, email me. But it's a concern. When you start talking about you're going to close off your borders altogether so no one can get in or no one can get out, that is a problem. All right? Let me keep reading so I can end this section for today. There were still restrictions on Asian immigration and the ability to become citizens in the United States. A significant number of Asians chose to immigrate to Australia or stayed within Asia itself. Although Southern and Eastern Europeans were becoming accepted as Americans, there was still racism against African Americans who at this time were living under segregation. Opposition continued against accepting non-white and Jewish immigrants who some Americans thought could never assimilate. The biggest issue that affected how Americans felt about immigration, however, was the growing number and increasing power of communist governments. The Soviet Union, at the time USSR, an American ally during World War II, was communist. So were the countries of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, that the USSR had been given control of after World War II. Mainland China formed a communist government in 1949, and communists were gaining power in Southeast Asia. The Cold War between these countries and the democratic countries, mainly the US, as well as the countries of Western Europe, including England and France, lasted until the early 1990s. It was a Cold War because there was no major direct fighting between the United States, Western Europe, the USSR, and China. But both sides began to build and store huge numbers of atomic bombs and other weapons. Military threats and political tension were in the news every single week. Each side supported different countries in political and military battles around the world, including Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, even when these battles had little to do with communism or democracy. The United States shaped much of its immigration policy to help refugees from communist countries. It also aided refugees to remind the world that America was a country of freedom, not racism. I mean, who can accuse us of racism if we're letting in people from other countries, but we're oppressing our own citizens? The government passed laws to accept people who were no longer living in their home countries because political boundaries had changed, or who would be persecuted if they returned home after World War II. These immigrants would not be counted in the quota system. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948, extended for 2 more years in 1950, admitted 415,000 refugees to the United States over 4 years. The law applied only to Europeans, not Asians, who had suffered hardships. Some were Jews who had been persecuted by the Nazis, but many others were allowed to immigrate simply because they were anti-communist. All right? So, when we come back next week, we're going to continue talking about communism, the waves of Cubans that came, and where they wound up. At the same time, it had all of this goodwill towards other nations, especially those at the very same time they were denying their own citizens opportunity and access. Oh, the irony. But we know that later in time, the irony came to a head and people began to say, we've had enough. This has been another Daring Dialogues, and I have been your host today. I hope that I have shared something historical that will help you to understand where we are in this country right now. Help us to see some of the patterns that are repeating. All right, these are not new things that are happening. We just need to understand that history is repeating itself. And we need to pray that we don't get caught up in the negative cycles of history repeating itself. All right. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. Thank you again for your time and attention. Take care and God bless.